There are things that managers say after baseball games. Safe things. Calculated things. The carefully constructed language of professional sports communication that acknowledges what happened without revealing too much, praise for the effort, respect for the opponent, confidence in the process. Words assembled specifically to fill the space between a microphone and a reporter's notebook without producing anything that could become a problem the next morning. Every manager in baseball has mastered this language. It is part of the job. It is, in many ways, the most consistent skill in the entire sport, more reliable than any pitcher's fastball, more dependable than any cleanup hitter's average. Tony Vitello mastered it years ago. Which is exactly why what he said after this particular game landed the way it did. Because Vitello did not reach for the safe language. He did not assemble the careful words. He stood in front of reporters who expected the familiar rhythm of post-game media and said something that nobody, not the reporters in the room, not the analysts watching the feed, not the producers in broadcast trucks who have heard thousands of post-game press conferences and stopped being surprised by any of them, saw coming. One comment. Completely unexpected. From a manager who is paid, in part, to never be completely unexpected. And that was before anyone had even begun processing what Ohtani had done on the field. Because the pitching performance that preceded Vitello's comment was already sending shockwaves through every baseball broadcast, every analytics platform, every corner of the American sports media that pays attention to what is happening in the National League. And the actions Ohtani took during that game, moments that went beyond the statistics, beyond the strikeout totals and the pitch velocities and the ERA that keeps defying explanation, had given the media something they almost never get. A genuine surprise. From the one player in baseball they thought they had fully figured out. The uproar has not stopped since. Here is everything that happened. To understand why the media responded the way it did, you first need to understand what Ohtani produced on that mound. This was not a good start that became a great story through the alchemy of post-game narrative. This was a performance that announced itself in the very first inning and refused to become ordinary for the 7 innings that followed. The kind of start where the broadcast team runs out of adequate superlatives by the 3rd inning and spends the final 4 innings simply describing what they are seeing because description has become more honest than analysis. His fastball command was precise in a way that bordered on unfair. Not just in terms of location, though the location was exceptional, painting corners and working both edges of the zone with a consistency that the opposing lineup had no sustainable answer for. The precision was temporal. The timing of when he chose to throw his fastball, within at-bats and across the full sequence of the game, reflected an understanding of how the opposing lineup was processing information in real time. He was not reacting to hitters. He was operating 3 pitches ahead of them. By the 4th inning, the Giants had adjusted their approach twice, both times responding to what Ohtani had done in the previous inning, both times arriving at a solution that Ohtani had already anticipated and built a counter-response for. It was chess played at a speed that chess is not supposed to be played at. And the helplessness that produced in an opposing lineup is something that statistics do not capture and highlight reels do not convey. You have to watch the full game. Every at-bat from the first pitch. To understand what the Giants were experiencing. The media watching in studios and broadcast trucks understood it immediately. And they began preparing for what they expected would be a straightforward post-game story, exceptional pitching performance, ERA discussion, MVP conversation, the usual framework that Ohtani starts generate these days. Then the unexpected actions happened. And everything changed. Shohei Ohtani is one of the most studied athletes on the planet. Every gesture, every at-bat, every interaction on the field has been filmed, analyzed, and catalogued by an army of observers who have made understanding his behavior a professional specialty. Which makes genuine surprises from him extraordinarily rare. This game produced several. The first came in the 3rd inning. After recording the second out of the inning on a pitch that drew an audible reaction from the crowd, Ohtani did something that nobody in the stadium or watching on broadcast had seen him do before, at least not in this specific context, not with this particular audience and this particular opponent. A gesture. Small, brief, directed not toward the dugout or the crowd but toward the opposing dugout specifically. Not aggressive. Not taunting. Something more nuanced than either of those things, an acknowledgement, a communication, a moment of connection between competitors that lasted less than 2 seconds and somehow conveyed something that reporters would spend the next hour trying to articulate in print. The opposing dugout responded. That was the second surprise. Because the response was not the defensive silence of a team being embarrassed. It was, and multiple witnesses confirmed this independently, a response that carried warmth. A recognition. As if the gesture had opened a channel of communication between competitors that the game itself, for all its intensity, had not managed to open. The Giants' dugout saw something in that moment. And what they saw changed the energy of the game without changing the score. The third unexpected action came later, in the 6th inning, in a situation where the game's competitive pressure was at its peak. Ohtani stepped off the mound between pitches, not to regroup or recalibrate in the way that pitchers routinely step off. He stepped off and took a specific moment to look at the stadium around him. Not performing awareness for cameras. Genuinely looking at the crowd, at the sky, at the physical space of the ballpark in a way that spoke of someone pausing to be present in an experience that even he understood was extraordinary. Cameras caught it. The moment lasted 4 seconds. And those 4 seconds, Ohtani on the mound, briefly still, taking in the enormity of where he was and what he was doing, became the image that anchored every media report that followed. Because it was human in a way that his performance almost never is. It was a crack in the composure that revealed not vulnerability but wonder. And wonder, from the greatest player in baseball, is the most disarming thing in the world. The post-game press conference began in the expected way. Reporters settled. Cameras positioned. The standard rhythm of question and response began to take shape around the outline of what had been, by any measure, a difficult night for the Giants. Vitello handled the early questions with the professionalism that defines his media presence. He spoke about his team's effort, about specific moments in the game where he felt the Giants had competed well, about the adjustments they had attempted and what he saw from the opposing pitcher that made those adjustments so difficult to execute. Standard. Measured. Professional. And then a reporter asked him a direct question about Ohtani. Not about the pitching line. Not about the ERA or the strikeout total. About the moments during the game, the gesture in the 3rd inning, the pause on the mound in the 6th, that had generated so much conversation in the broadcast and on social media in real time. Vitello paused. Longer than his usual pause. Long enough that the reporters in the room exchanged glances, recognizing that something was loading behind that stillness that was not the standard prepared response. And then he said it. He said that in all his years in professional baseball, in all the games he had managed, all the opponents he had prepared against, all the players he had watched develop and perform and occasionally transcend the reasonable boundaries of what the sport was supposed to produce, he had never, not once, walked away from a game with the specific feeling he was walking away with tonight. Not admiration. He had felt admiration before. Not respect. He had felt respect for opponents throughout his career and had learned to separate that respect from the competitive necessity of trying to defeat them. What he felt, he said, was something closer to privilege. The privilege of being in the same baseball game as Shohei Ohtani. Of having a front row seat to something that he was not certain, even now, that he fully understood. Of managing a team against a competitor whose preparation, execution, and, he paused here, choosing his word carefully, humanity during the game had produced something that a simple box score could not begin to contain. The room was very quiet when he finished. One reporter, veteran of hundreds of post-game sessions, later described it as the most honest thing he had heard a manager say in public in years. By the time Vitello's comments reached the first wave of sports broadcast, the reaction had already begun. The performance alone, 7 innings, the ERA conversation, the strikeout sequence, would have generated significant coverage. Ohtani's starts always do. The metrics and the history and the MVP implications are a ready-made story that writes itself with minimal additional reporting. But Vitello's comment changed the nature of the coverage entirely. Because a manager using the word privilege to describe the experience of competing against an opponent is not standard sports language. It is not the language of competition. It is the language of something more personal, more genuine, more difficult to package into a standard sports broadcast segment. ESPN led with it. The major baseball analytics platforms shifted their framing from statistical analysis to something harder to quantify. Writers who cover the sport with the detachment of people who have seen everything found themselves writing with a different energy, the energy of people who had also, in their own way, been surprised tonight. The unexpected actions during the game, the gesture, the moment on the mound, the brief and genuine human pause in the middle of an inhuman performance, gave those writers specific images to anchor their reactions to. They were not writing abstractly about greatness. They were writing about 4 seconds of a pitcher looking at the sky. About a 2-second gesture toward an opposing dugout. About small, specific moments of humanity embedded inside a performance that seemed to exist beyond the human scale. Social media followed the broadcast coverage with the speed that social media always follows things that combine genuine emotion with undeniable excellence. The images traveled. The Vitello quote traveled faster. By midnight, the conversation had crossed from baseball-specific platforms into the broader sports world and beyond, the kind of reach that a regular season pitching start almost never generates. Because it was not, in the end, about the pitching start. It was about what Vitello said. What those moments during the game revealed. What happens when the greatest player in baseball steps off the mound in the 6th inning and takes 4 seconds to be a human being in the middle of something extraordinary? By the time Otani himself stood in front of reporters, the narrative had already fully formed around him. Every camera in the room was carrying the weight of everything that had been said and written and broadcast in the previous hour. He handled it the way he handles everything. Quietly. Directly. Without performance. He spoke about the game with the technical precision of a pitcher who processes his starts in terms of execution and process, what worked, what he wanted to do better, where the sequencing felt right and where he felt he had left opportunities unused. The language of a professional who evaluates himself against an internal standard that exists independently of what anyone else saw or felt or said about the same performance. When asked about the moment in the 6th inning, the pause, the 4 seconds, the image that had traveled around the world, he considered the question for a moment in that characteristic way of his. The stillness before the response that always suggests more is happening internally than will be expressed externally. He said that there are moments in games when he becomes aware of something beyond the immediate competitive situation. When the full weight of where he is and what he is doing and who he is doing it in front of arrives in a way that he cannot and does not want to dismiss. When gratitude becomes more present than strategy. He said he did not think that was weakness. He said he thought it was necessary. And then he gathered his things and left the room. The reporters sat with it. The cameras kept running. And somewhere in a broadcast truck, someone was already building the package that would lead the morning shows, the clip of Vitello saying privilege, the 4 seconds on the mound, the Otani quote about gratitude. 3 moments from one night. Each one small. Together, the whole story. American sports media is not easily surprised. It is staffed by people who have covered championships and scandals and the full range of human athletic achievement. Who have watched careers begin and end and begin again. Who have sat in rooms with the greatest competitors the sport has ever produced and learned, over years of proximity to excellence, to process even the most extraordinary performances within a familiar framework. This night broke the framework. Not because of the ERA. Not because of the strikeout total. Not because of the pitching line that will sit in the record books long after the season is over. Because of a gesture toward an opposing dugout in the 3rd inning that carried more communication than most players manage in an entire series. Because of 4 seconds on the mound in the 6th inning where the greatest player in baseball stopped to feel grateful. Because of a manager who chose the word privilege in a post-game press conference and meant every syllable of it. And because of an athlete who, when asked to explain the most human moment of a superhuman performance, said that gratitude is not weakness. He said it is necessary. Shohei Ohtani pitched 7 innings. He struck out batters. He produced numbers that the history of the sport struggles to contextualize. And in the middle of all of it, in the 4th second of a 4-second pause on a baseball mound in front of 56,000 people, he reminded everyone watching that the most extraordinary thing about him has never been the numbers. It has always been this.